Imagine you lead and coach a soccer team. You have 4 of your players who do everything that they can to practice regularly, score goals, and win games. Then you have 5 players on your team who like to look like they are contributing. They occasionally and half-heartedly attend practices, make a pass or two in the game, but are more interested in how they look versus how they perform. Finally, you have 2 players who actively disrupt practice, make passes to the other team in games, and score goals on your own net. Now imagine this is your workplace.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Thoughtful Talent Show. I'm Jen Werner of Jen Werner Coaching.
And I'm Chad Ahern of Talent Team Consulting.
And today, with that great analogy, we're going to talk about employee engagement. Chad, there are so many statistics on employee engagement. Do you want to share just a few of those with us so we can kind of round out why this is so important and why we're focusing on it today?
Yeah. So the reason I started with the analogy that I did and the numbers of players on the team, obviously the soccer team's got 11 players. I broke down the stats based on Gallup's current research on employee engagement, particularly here in the US and Canada. And I've got some worldwide stats to share in a second. But here in the US and Canada, employee engagement is rounding out around 33% of engaged employees. Those are the ones that are doing everything that they can. 51% are not particularly engaged. Those are the kind of ones, people just sort of half-heartedly showing up. And then 16% of our workforce is actively disengaged. They are disrupting other people's work. They are subverting the organizational success. They're not being particularly helpful. Now, when we look at the world stats, it usually ends up around 20%. I think it might be up to 23% actively engaged. The middle section is a little bit bigger because that's where the main shift is. It's about 10% more in the not engaged. So around 60% are disengaged or not engaged. And then it's a similar stats, about 13%, about 20% are actively disengaged. So there's some slight modifications, but the big one is that surprisingly, the US and Canada are a bit ahead of the curve in terms of active engagement. It's interesting, we're doing this episode now because just about a month and a half ago, Gallup came out with their annual state of the workforce. And so there are all sorts of other stats. We're actually going to link to that report in the show notes. But just a couple other reasons why we're talking about this. So when organizations focus on employee engagement, there's a 78% decrease in absenteeism. So for regions like mine, where workforce is not growing particularly quickly, and we're, it's a bit of a struggle to find people, having people actually show up and contribute their best on a regular basis is a good idea. There's also an increase in customer loyalty, about 10% boost in that stat. And then here are the 3 big ones that I always focus on when I'm coaching teams is 23% increase in profitability, a 70% increase in employee well-being. I know that you want to talk about, and that's a big one for you. And then 22% increase in organizational participation. So that's essentially people really coming on to the organization's mission and accepting the values and just wholeheartedly putting themselves into the work. So those are some quick stats. I've got more that we're going to cover later in the episode. And there's a bucket full of them in the Gallup State of the Workforce report that came out. But I know that our episode isn't just going to be about the stats. I'm curious, Jen, you and I had a little pre-conversation about why we wanted to do this. I would like you to share with our audience why you feel that this topic is so important.
Chad, those stats are, staggering to me, and understanding your well-being, your own engagement, and then really understanding what that means to what that does to your workforce. So you talked a little bit about that well-being, and I think engagement is kind of like well-being. Like if you're not engaged, you're similarly like you're not at your best in your well-being. So, if you didn't get a good night's sleep last night and then you try to be at your best, you can't be there. So being disengaged or being not engaged would be the same, kind of have the same impacts as not having great well-being. Because Gallup focuses so much on strengths and not weaknesses, there's a whole big thing about engagement and understanding engaged employees versus disengaged employees. 61% of the people who responded said that when their manager focuses on their strengths, they're engaged, compared to only 1% of them are disengaged. So if you're talking to people about what they do well, like, your engagement scores will go up. You will be more engaged. Your employees will be more engaged. But you also can be engaged when they focus on your weakness, which is what everybody's been doing for all this time. In businesses, we focus on what we're not doing well and trying to get better in those areas. When they do that, 45% of those employees are engaged versus 23% are disengaged. So you could see that range goes up a lot, from 1% to 23%.
Yeah.
But worst of all, and this is, I think, the big takeaway about engagement, worst of all, is just being ignored. So, really understanding that we want to focus on what's right with people, and doing so will help you be more engaged as an employee.
So what I find interesting, my analytical brain kicks into those stats, and I mentioned the US Canada stats of around 33% being actively engaged. Yeah. And yet we know from the research that when managers and organizations focus on strengths, that number can be as high as 60. I've even seen stats as high as 80% actively engaged when you couple strengths with a bunch of other things. But the massive takeaway there is the reason we're seeing that such a drag on that, from the 80% down to what's being reported at 33%, is the managers not paying attention or not engaging or interacting with their employees. So I think that's just a really interesting takeaway as we start this episode, that the manager has such a place to play, and also the role of strengths, and focusing on that has such a role to play in the whole conversation.
Chad, I've actually found myself, throughout my career, I found myself in all of those positions on the field. Like, being engaged and being an engaged employee feels amazing. We talk about that feeling of being in flow a lot, with strengths, and knowing what's expected of me, being able to do what I do best, and that being recognized for my work, my contributions, feeling that my what I do at work is important and leads to, like, the big goals for the company. But I've also been on the complete other end, where I wouldn't mind seeing this team lose or completely fail. And that place feels terrible, So for me, and even hearing from others that I've worked with, helping them with their engagement, their understanding, getting their voice heard, this disengaged feeling typically comes from that, like, feeling used and underappreciated. If you spend enough time in that place, as a star employee, you might be the number one, fully, like, actively engaged, you're the one, like, leading the team. But man, you could, if you spend too much time in that space where you're feeling used or unappreciated, ignored, you can go from that giving 110% to just going through the motions and not putting in any effort at all. Adding, and then, at spending time at that stage, then just even adding, like, little struggles, like from not feeling your worth, as far as pay goes, spending too many hours at the office. Maybe it's even just a just generic conflict with an employee, or yet more things added to your already full plate that we talked about with the burnout episode. That going through the motions could quickly downgrade to where you're looking at some of those behaviors we talked about in our trust episode, where you might be, like, extremely critical of others. You're unwilling to, like, lend a hand and help the team. You might be argumentative extra defensive about the work you're doing, or just making sure you're constantly covering your own behind, so it feels terrible to be in that place. And it's amazing the types of things that can flip, that for us, where we can just as quickly as it can go downhill, you could actually just as quickly turn that around. Chad, do you want to talk about some of those ways that we've
Yeah.
seen that turn around?
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting components that you touched on, just the lightest touch on, but I think it's so important. And it intros into something I wanted to mention as we think about this employee engagement, is a lot of the teams that I start to explore such engagements with, they'll say, oh, well, we've got really high satisfaction scores. We can't seem to get ahead of, we can't seem to achieve our goals, or we can't seem to get ahead of the workload. And I think this is a big maybe misconception, or needs some definition around. There's a
Yeah.
massive difference between employee engagement and employee satisfaction. Those are two very different things. And I think a lot of people sort of equate them to each other, and they really shouldn't. You could be very satisfied. If you're pulling six figures, you've got vacation, they let you take trips with family members to wherever you want. If the company has a location in a different state, great, go work there for 3 months. Those sorts of perks can make somebody feel very satisfied with their job or their setup, or what they're getting in terms of benefits. Maybe the health insurance is really great. That doesn't necessarily mean they're engaged. You can have somebody that's very satisfied, just sort of kind of coasting along, doing just enough to not get fired, and just enough to be above the report
Yep.
medium to high satisfaction scores. But their engagement and what they're actually doing for the team, they're in that part of the soccer team analogy where they prefer to look good versus contribute good. And
Yeah.
so I would, all of our leader listeners out there, if you're taking notes, this is a key one. Go and check with whoever is doing your engagement scoring or your satisfaction scoring. Are you measuring satisfaction? Are you measuring engagement? So that's one. I will
Oh,
also
Chad,
say that,
that's so good.
yeah,
I'm so glad that you brought that up about the satisfaction, because you're right. You can be satisfied in your work, but that does not mean that you're actually giving that your full effort and really moving the team forward. You might just be status quo, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
I will just put out the clarifier that even when Gallup does employee engagement research, and when teams use their Q12 plus employee engagement assessment, satisfaction is not ignored. It's actually question 00 of the 12 questions. It's kind of a bonus question that Gallup does use to kind of baseline certain responses. I don't know all the algorithms on the back end of their system, but they do consider satisfaction. It just happens to be one question instead of some of the surveys I've seen, which are 50, 60, 80 questions long, trying to get at, are you satisfied with this employer? So that's be my first point. I think
Yeah.
one of the other pieces, and you kind of touched on some of our previous episodes in terms of burnout and well-being, I would also bring in the setting expectations. So one of the key places where you can bolster employee engagement right off the bat, and it's sort of a twofold approach. One is it ties into some of the employee engagement statements that Gallup uses, commonly referred to as the Q12. So question number one is, I know what's expected of me at work. Question two is, I have the resources to do my job the right way. And question 9 is, my associates and my fellow employees are committed to doing quality work. Now, all those three, especially questions 1 and 2, are baseline statements that tie into our conversation around setting expectations. And what needs to be done, what are the standards in this environment. Some people might even refer to that as culture. But if you take those two questions and then also focus it on the onboarding process. I've seen a lot of research around when organizations really do a solid job of setting those expectations and making sure the resources are there when somebody first starts, even before there's sometimes their first day, making sure that that's all in place. There is a massive uptick in the baseline employee engagement levels of your workforce before the person even starts. So I wanted to touch on a previous episode talking about this employee engagement. I think the other idea that I came across as I was researching for this episode is the idea of taking things away, and not so much taking resources away, but we talked about having that really full plate when it comes to burnout. There's some research by Gartner research that says that to increase engagement, they focus on HR, but I would pose that it also applies to leaders, that they should engage in active dialogue with employees to identify and reduce work friction, things that make employees' everyday work harder, also providing needed and desired development opportunities. So it's again that right sizing of the plate comes back into play when we're talking about employee engagement. If you are expecting the world of your employees, expecting them to work 16-hour days to get it all done, you're going to quickly kill employee engagement, because as you said, they start burning it at both ends of the candle. They soon become wrapped up in covering their own work, make sure that they're they end up not getting enough rest, impacts their well-being, impacts their employee engagement. So I wanted to bring that in as you were talking about the ideas of rest and well-being. There's also a sense of right sizing here too.
Oh, sure. And we know that, you can have a actively engaged employee, who is giving 110%, but still get burnt out. So that's a fine threshold there, that line that once you step over it, that, you could really get yourself in trouble. So understanding where that line is for you, and then having the resources, having your manager there, having, your supervisor be able to see and recognize when there's really too much coming your way, or you being able to raise your hand and say, I've got too much going on here. You need to take some off. I love that.
Yeah. There was one other point I wanted to get to, and I know that you and I have had some conversations off podcast around this, of the importance of recognition, which I also know is heavily talked about right now. It's a topic I know we're going to come back to in a future episode of this podcast. But Gallup and WorkHuman, another great organization, just did a research project together, and they found that when employees who feel fulfilled by recognition are 4 times as likely to be engaged in their work. Okay, so they also point out that when recognition programs hit the right mark, 73% are less likely to always or very often feel burned out. We got that burned out touch again. And 56% people are less likely to be looking for or watching for new job opportunities. So if you're a leader worrying about people jumping ship, leaving your team in the lurch, recognition and focusing on that impact on employee engagement really should be at the top of your list.
Yeah.
And I know you have some comments about recognition too. So I don't want to take all the thunder here.
And I don't want to go too far into it, because we are dedicating an entire episode just to recognition, because if you don't get this right, you could be actively disengaging your workforce. So it's just so important to make sure that you're recognizing your people and their efforts and their contributions to the team. It's absolutely, that 4 times the as likely to be engaged if you're, recognized appropriately. If that's a big deal, and easy, free. You're doing a great job. thank you for, coming in and staying late, whatever that might be, like
Yeah.
this can be free.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially in this cost-conscious world, right? And leaders are often looking for
Right.
free things to do to keep their people. Recognition,
Yes.
focusing on employee engagement are big ones.
Yeah.
Jen, given that we're both strengths-based coaches, I know that we've always tried to focus each of our episodes on how strengths can help. I'm
Yeah.
curious if you
I
have
did.
some initial thoughts on
I
where
do.
you thought strengths could apply or be helpful in terms of either addressing employee engagement or helping
Sure.
bolster it. What are your thoughts?
And on past episodes, I've gone into like what strengths I think can help with this, but on this one, I went a little like I zoomed out a bit because I think it's about understanding like how utilizing our own personal strengths can help us and our team achieve our goals. So really focusing on like kind of some 4 key questions. How can we utilize our talents to connect with each other? Because again, our engagement isn't just about us. It involves the team, that soccer team on the field. Those that are disengaged are affecting the engaged team players too. So, really understanding like ways that you can connect with each other and the team. Number 2, how to better recognize and appreciate the talents and contributions of others that are on your team. Whether that's understanding what it is that feeds them, motivates them to do more or be a bigger part of the team, or even just like I said, recognizing their contribution and what they've brought. How can you use your own talents to be accountable to your team? And I think that's a big one. We've talked about accountability in the trust episode, and I think also in the setting expectations episode. Knowing that we want to be accountable, but what can we do to use our talents to help us get there? And then my last question I think I would ask is like, how can we calibrate our talents? So it's again, back to that double-edged sword feeling, so that we're working better together towards our goal, understanding where that friction might be. And you talked about that at the very beginning of the episode, understanding some of that friction, and then working through what that looks like for us to work better together. So we're not feeling like we need to just keep it all close and tight and under our own control. How can we, calibrate our talents so that we can give up some of that, so that as a team we're getting where we need to be.
Yeah,
I
it's
know,
interesting.
I know this has lots of implications with some of those questions to the Q12.
Yeah. Well, before I get to my thoughts, and they are tied to the Q12.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you bringing that sort of calibrating our talents. Because one of the ideas I cover a lot in some of the workshops I do is this idea of kind of having overlapping stars. So if we think about our talents as sort of the points of a star,
Yep.
where we're strongest, we also have valleys between those. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that somebody else's star doesn't provide a perfect overlap to fill in. Because as the
Right.
research from I think it's Tom Rath, who has done a lot of publishing for Gallup over the years. He has a great quote of, "We shouldn't aim for well-rounded individuals. We should aim for
Right.
well-rounded teams." And it's
Yes.
when you start to piece together all those talents and figure out where the overlaps are and calibrate, that's where you get the well-rounded team while still
Yeah.
allowing each person to be engaged and focusing on their strengths in terms of their points of the stars. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because sometimes it
Yeah.
is about figuring out, okay, which gaps am I filling in? How do I need to
Great.
sort of best fit the piece that the team needs me to fit,
Mm-hmm.
based on my talents. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Back
Yeah.
around to where I think strengths and engagement really integrate. Um, this is based on my own understandings of the research around Q12 and the tie between strengths and employee engagement. But I think there are really 4 key statements that come out of the Q12 um, that almost specifically call on strengths. And
Mm-hmm.
they are whether you want to call them statements or questions, but it's Q3, Q6, Q11, and Q number 12. Okay, so Q3 is I have opportunities to do what I do best every day. Well, if that's not a strengths-based statement, I'm not sure what else qualifies.
Right.
This is where leaders, if you're thinking about how to get strengths to impact somebody's employee engagement, focus on what they do best, figure out what that is. If you need help, that's where Jen and I come in as CliftonStrengths coaches and help you figure out what you do best and what your teammates do best. Once you do that, you have a big lever in terms of driving employee engagement. Cue number 6 is there's someone at work who encourages my development. If you don't know what somebody's strengths are and what knowledge and skills they need to develop in and around that talent to make it a strength, you have a problem. But when you focus on that, you show up as somebody who is encouraging their development, and you know what that development needs to look like, which is going to be something that I'm going to return to in just a second. Cue number 11 is in the past 6 months, someone has talked to me about about my progress at work. Okay, if again you know what that person is trying to do in terms of applying or aiming their strengths to drive progress for themselves or the team or the organization, you have something to talk about, and therefore you also should be coming back to that conversation on a regular basis. I know that's something that Jen and I talk a lot about when we coach individuals and teams is how are you having individual conversations with your leader around where you're going, how are you using your talents to get there, but then also talking to leaders about making sure that they're having those conversations so that they know how that person wants to develop. And then Q12 is again a sort of a development question. Q number 12 is this in this past year, I've had opportunities to work, to learn and grow. Again, rinse and repeat, right? This is
Right.
if we don't talk about our strengths and we don't figure out the right opportunities to learn and grow those strengths and apply them, then again, you have an employee engagement problem. Q11 and Q12, I will admit, are at the top of the hierarchy of the Q12. You need to address a lot of the base level ones like Q1, 2, and 3 before you really address Q11 and 12. But if you don't finish that pyramid, if you don't finish those last 2 statements, again, you're going to see a distinct drop off in your employee engagement across all your team members. So this is where I think strengths can really help, is that it can help frame a lot of these conversations that then drive aspects of what the research has shown is of how you measure employee engagement. So there's a
Right.
kind of a follow-on effect. So
Yeah, and
that's
having
what.
that. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead. No, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, and going back to that, even like the Q1, Q2, that I know what's expected of me at work, and I have the tools to do my job. The tools I need to do what I do best. Even understanding like just the basics, just to that point, can make such a difference in engagement. If you don't know what you're supposed to be doing at work, I don't know how you could possibly be engaged. So yeah, there's it, and that leads right to your strengths, understanding how to set those expectations for your strengths, even like, and if you don't understand your team and what they do best, I don't know how you're setting the expectations for your team. It's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. So we've already started talking about strengths. I appreciate that both of us went sort of bigger picture versus
Yeah.
nailing down on certain strengths. But I am curious, now that we've talked about how strengths can be applied to enhancing employee engagement, I'm curious, what do you think leaders should be doing differently or could do better?
Yeah, I think they've said weekly meaningful conversations, and we've said it. I feel like we're broken record. We've said it over and over and over again. You need to be having these like one-on-one conversations with your people weekly. So from a manager standpoint, it sounds like a lot. It doesn't have to be a big, long, like half-hour conversation. It doesn't need to be like pull you into the office and have this whole formal thing. It's asking questions, being there. Things like, how are you doing? Just checking in. How are you doing? What are you most excited about today? what challenges are you currently facing, and how can I support you in what you're doing? Like those are quick, easy things to be able to ask. And if you're touching base with your employees regularly, at least weekly, and asking even just those 4 simple questions when you talk to them, you're going to get to this more personal level. You're connecting to your team on that personal level. You're giving them the opportunity to share with you what they're most excited about. So even if you don't know their strengths, their actual like CliftonStrengths talents,
Yeah.
understanding what they're most excited about, you're going to get clues to that talent. Like, these are the things they really enjoy doing. Well, how can we help them do more of that? They found that in Gallup study, I'm going to like bring my one little stat in I have, and I don't know what study it came from, but they found that when they asked if this, weekly conversations was happening, if these meaningful conversations with their manager are happening, only 16% of people reported that they actually were having meaningful conversations with their manager. But of those 16%, 80% of them were engaged. Like, that's huge. So these 4 simple questions have such a potential to lead to, this like deeper level of engagement and connection with one another.
Yeah. I'd like to just point out 2 things in what you just said, which I think is super helpful. One, leaders, if you're thinking about, cost, these are things you can do for free, right? These questions, you're simply just having a conversation with people. You're just reframing, so many of us, Jen and I, you and I have had conversations about, leaders we've had and whether we've been engaged or disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
But the really good leaders, if they're checking with you, great. Okay, that's baseline. Okay.
Yep.
But a lot of times it ends at a sort of a surface level. And I think the questions you've just posed provide a structure to that conversation and something that's actually meaningful. I think that's a big difference that Gallup puts on that phrase. It's not just a conversation, it's a meaningful conversation. So it's free, it's structured, doesn't have to take long, as Jed pointed out. But I would also put a big asterisk on listen to the responses. Don't just ask them to be like, okay, yeah, and then move on. The real value here for what leaders need to be doing differently is that I think, some of the leaders you and I have talked about have sort of maybe asked versions of these questions and then done nothing with them. And, they're just looking for the update. They're not looking for where are we trying to go or what are we trying to do or what's getting in our way. And then being part of the solution to help address those challenges or those hurdles that we need, that can only be removed by our leaders because they are further up the organizational chart than maybe we can impact. So the big asterisk there is listen to the responses and then be prepared to do your best. You may not be able to guarantee every action, but do your best to take action on what they've just told you.
Thank you so much for like bookending my questions there with that listening and responding, because that goes back to that being ignored. Like at that point, if you've heard it and done nothing with the information your people gave you, you're essentially ignoring them again. So, really understanding that's that key part. Thank you, Chad. Thank you for bringing that.
No. And to your point about the ignoring or, not taking action, I didn't bring stats around this because I didn't realize we were going to, hit on this exact point. But there is some research out there that I know I've read that it's almost worse to ask for the input and then ignore it versus just ignore them in the first place, because now you've set the expectation that, my leader is giving me the impression that they care about what I'm doing and what I need help with. And then when you do nothing with it, you actually accelerate the active disengagement because they're like, well, my leader doesn't care about me. Why should I give a hoot about what's going on in the organization? So just if you're going to ask the questions, and I think Jen's question, Jen, the questions you pose are fantastic, but you need to listen and you need to respond appropriately to the input that you're given. So anyway, I didn't want to be your be the subject, but it's so worth hammering
It
away at,
is.
because so many leaders don't, as your stats point out, only 60% of employees are getting these kinds of conversations. And yet the upside is so massive.
Right.
It's
Right.
yeah. So
And 16% are being, having meaningful conversations. What's happening to everyone else? Like they're ignored, or they're only getting talked at when they're doing something wrong. It's just insane.
yeah. So my point to our listeners is, you're one of the better leaders that has increased that 16%. Hopefully, maybe
Yes.
next time we do an episode on this topic, it will have grown a bit.
Oh,
I'd
move the
like to put
needle.
my, yes, move the needle a little bit. Jim, were there any other thoughts that you had on
I,
what leaders
I
can be doing
had some,
differently? Because I have my own thoughts, but I want to make sure I don't.
yeah. So similarly, as we talked about with understanding our own talents and how our strengths can help with that engagement, for the managers, I looked at, like 4 key questions that you can kind of ask yourself about using your talents to help with, this employee engagement. And my number one question would be, how can you use your talents to help build that stronger, more personal connection, relationship with those on your team? Number 2, how can your talents help you empower your team to ask for what they need to do their best work? So this isn't necessarily asking them what it is that they need to do their best work, but giving them the opportunity, giving them the permission to voice those things that they need. Then number 3 would be, how could your talents help you be transparent in the midst of change? So really giving that stability to what's going on, the transparency, the open conversations. This is what I see coming. This is what's happening. How can your talents help to stabilize your team in times of chaos or big change? And then question number 4 would be, how could your talents encourage your team to be bolder, take more risks, maybe think bigger and future forward? Because your talents yourselves, you may have some of those futuristic talents, have some of those other like bigger thinking talents, but how can your talents encourage your employees, those that are members of your team? How can you help them to start to see the bigger picture, have hope for where we're going together as a team? So I think
Great
those were
questions.
my big takeaways. Yeah.
Yeah, I find your last question there an interesting one, in terms of being bold and taking risks, because it alludes to the fact that a lot of the Q12 that we've mentioned is all forward thinking. It's
Mm-hmm.
so often when we think about employee engagement or satisfaction, it's usually rear view thinking, like how satisfied have you been over the
Right.
past 6 months or year? And the Q12 is nice because yes, it provides a little bit of a reflection, but really it's posed as questions thing about, okay, now if I want to engage you further, how can I better facilitate
Yeah.
responding to these 12 actually now 16 questions. I know it's called the
Right.
Q12. They just added 4 questions. Gallup did. So I find that a really interesting take, in terms of being bold and taking risks, because it
It,
does kind of come back around to the employee engagement side of how do you get people to
right.
think more forward? How do you get them to think about developing themselves, being engaged in the organization? So
It's
nice add there, Jen.
Thanks. Well, it's like you said with the listening and responding. Like, okay, now I've heard you, but now what? Or we have the
Right.
answers to these questions, but now what? What are we going to do with this? And so that's
Yeah,
where that one kind of came from. Yeah, thanks.
nice.
What could you add for, what
Yeah.
managers can do to
So
help move this needle?
yeah, so I think one real big one that often gets overlooked is make sure you're engaged first. If you're a leader
Yes.
of a team, I know it sounds like a really sort of almost cliche-ish statement to make, but you really need to pause and think about how engaged are you, as a leader, as somebody at the organization. Because if you're like the first and second tier leaders that Jen and I are often engaging with, you probably have a leader, and they should probably be doing some work and having some conversations with you about your level of engagement. And the reason that this is so important is that, again, Gallup research, they are sort of I won't say the Bible on this, but they are one of the main drivers of the research around employee engagement. Gallup has found that 70% of the variance in employee engagement on the team is directly attributable to the immediate manager, people leader, that those people report to. So if you're not engaged, you are having a disproportionate impact on the engagement of those that report to you.
Sure.
So take a step back, really look at your own engagement, make sure that that gets squared away first, and then you'll be in a much better place to ensure the engagement of those that you lead. So that's my first take.
Chad,
Oh.
it immediately brought me back to your analogy at the beginning. What if the coach is disengaged?
Right.
Like, what does that do to the players? Like if your coach doesn't show up to practice, how well are your team, your team, your players going to react to that? So I think that's a absolutely great point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. I know you had more.
No, it's okay. And then, so I would then also, and this is actually a place where I am going to start bringing up certain talent themes, but just as pure examples. So I would also pose to leaders, start thinking about how your talents can help you facilitate positive employee engagement for each team member. So for example, maybe you have command as one of your top talent themes. How are you using that to advocate for better resources, better materials, the right work schedule for your team? How are you using to lean in and address some of those statements from the Q12? Another one I get thinking about, how maybe somebody with developer or learner, how are they helping find the right personalized special development opportunities for each team member? Again, based on that team member's talent themes, not necessarily on yours, but how can you use your ability to go out and research or go out and want to develop that person to then find the right opportunities? And then a last one, just as a pure example, is, how is maybe you've got focus. How is your focus helping you or hindering your ability to connect with your team? Maybe your focus has got you all nose down in your own paper and you're not having those meaningful conversations, versus maybe flipping that and maybe using your focus to, hey, for today, my sole focus is going to be making those, having those meaningful conversations with people, or I'm going to go find the right development opportunities, or I'm going to think about finding the right resources and materials for somebody. How can you, take that dark side of the sword and turn it to the light side of the sword, that we've talked about, when it comes to each of our talents. So just think about, there are 34 talent themes, so I don't want to sit here and go through all 34 and think about each question, but think about how can you use your talent themes to address the key components of employee engagement. And I would go and recommend that leaders take a good solid look at the Q12 and think about, okay, how does my talent theme come to each one of these 12 statements? So that would be my plug for our leaders out there, of look at your talent themes. And if you want help, not to plug us too much, but Jen and I do this all the time.
I was just going to chime in and say that, like, if this is something that you don't understand how to use your talents in a different way, like, you were talking about like your focus talent, this is your executing talent, but how can you use that to build relationships? We can help you with that. So yeah, absolutely.
But as we wrap up this episode, are there any key takeaways that you'd like to kind of maybe come back and just put a little, final polish on, or share once again?
Yeah. And I think the big one for me is engagement isn't something that you do once a year or focus on, once every, like, so when something happens and you want to like do something, engagement happens in every single interaction that you're having. In our strengths language, we talk a lot about filling buckets, right? So it's those things, those activities, those words that fill our bucket, that make us feel good about what we're doing. And there was an episode in our first season where we talked about they're not, one of our guests shared with us that there are no neutral interactions, right? In every interaction, we're either giving value or taking it away. And I think regardless of whether you're a coworker, a manager, a leader, you need to be making a point to connect with others on that personal level, get to know them and listen to what they have to say, and then use that information to see how you can move forward together to build that trust and foster that engagement that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That would be mine.
I remember, I don't remember the exact episode, but I remember the quote that came after that, there is no neutral conversation or action.
Mm-hmm.
It's every action and every conversation you take is either a vote for the team you want or a vote against the team you want.
Yep.
And so it's purely you're putting, are you filling the negative bucket or are you filling the positive bucket? And so I appreciate you tying those two ideas together. I'm going to broaden this out. This isn't something we necessarily have talked about yet in this episode, but it is an idea that I'd like our leaders out there to think about, which is that employee engagement, in my opinion, is an underutilized economic engine. And by that, I mean that the productivity upticks that teams see when they have more actively engaged people is not insignificant. There was a fellow coach, Ryan Hammond, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's another strengths coach. He focuses very strongly on employee engagement. He's the I Love Mondays guy. If you've ever come across him on LinkedIn, he basically told me that if you have 6 actively engaged employees, you essentially create if each of those 6 people are working an 8-hour day, that over the course of a year, those 6 people actually generate the same amount of work as a 7-person team. You're getting essentially a single ghost worker if you have actively engaged employees. And so that idea has really stuck me, because here in Vermont and our neighboring states, we're having a tough time recruiting a workforce. And therefore, companies here locally, at least in the short term, need to find better ways of getting the work done. And so I think focusing on employee engagement would be a tool to get there. And then also you have the follow-on effect of, if you have actively engaged employees, they're more apt to go promote your organization, so that more people want to come move here and be hired by that organization and then stay here and work. So I think it's an underutilized economic engine. I also would like to point out, and part of this is probably tinted by my learner as my number one theme, but I am also going to point out that professional development cannot be an afterthought. As we highlighted before, several of the statements from the Geek 12, there's a measure of employee engagement, heavily lean toward, how are you developing your people? I think a lot of organizations get stuck on we'll send them off to a one-day conference or a one-time conference once a year, and that's their professional development. That cannot be the end of professional development. You have to have ongoing opportunities to learn and grow. And so I would just encourage the organizations and the leaders listening out there that put some more thought into professional development, because it will likely drive a lot of your employee engagement as well. That's my final thought.
Great point, Chad. And I think there's even stats around that. If we talk, bleeding in the generational conversation again, when we look at Gen Z and the millennials are begging for this. They want the development, they want the advancement, and a lot of folks in the workforce are saying, geez, they just get hired and within a month they're asking, how can they be promoted? What do you mean? You can be promoted in a month. You have to wait 4 years before you get there. They're eager for this information, eager to learn, eager to grow, spending that time to like really get that professional development down. Like you said, not a one and done. It doesn't get you there. No,
Yeah.
and definitely not with the younger generation who's going to be moving up into those manager roles. Like it's important that we get that development right.
Yeah. And so it'd be interesting to see where the data goes in terms of how much of an impact those couple statements like the Q number 11 and Q number 12 that are heavily focused on in professional development, whether the importance of those questions starts to accelerate
Start to move up.
given some of the
Yeah.
generational differences. Not that we want to get into, purely labeling people on generations. I know
Right.
for myself, I'm a Gen Xer and I love professional development, but part of that's driven by my learner. But I think
Right.
the bigger point is that it cannot be an afterthought. And I think your points about
Yeah.
generations and what they're clamoring for are well taken and should be well considered.
That's
Um,
great.
we've spent a wonderful amount of time talking about employee engagement. Uh, as Jen and I have alluded to throughout this conversation, this is a really important one for organizations out there, work coaches that stand ready to help people. If you want some help figuring out your team or your organization's employee engagement, I know it's a passion for me. And if you want more, come contact us. Our contact info will be in the show notes. And as always, I'm going to keep encouraging you to keep playing to your strengths.
And as always, be uniquely you.
If you like this episode, we encourage you to like, follow, and subscribe to wherever you find your podcasts.